Hello everyone, and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we are continuing with the Unbiased History of Rome. Today we are taking a look at the ascension and reign of Constantine the Great, one of Rome's truly last great figures, unfortunately. But without further ado, let's get going. The Cairo. We'll be talking about that a lot. The one punch intro. Yep. You know, it's perfect intro for Constantine. Oh no, the Picts and the Franks and the Alemanni. Yeah. Constantine crushing barbarians and usurpers alike with the power of Cairo, the Christian god. Oh, we got a whole cast this time. What an intro. One of the best.
It was the height of the crisis of the 3rd century. Claudius Gothicus had recently saved Nisus from the Gothic hordes. Thanks to him, his great-nephew could bear a child with his loved one, during the reign of Rome's greatest emperor. In time, the crisis would pass, and that child would surpass even his own legacy. This is the tale of Flavius Valerius Constantinus, or as history would know him, Constantine the Great. From a very early age, Constantine had it hard. Born and raised on the most dangerous imperial border, his father was constantly out fighting barbarians, leaving him to be raised by his mother, Helena, a saintly figure.
Yeah, so Constantine didn't have much of any relationship with his father. They didn't dislike each other or anything like that, but Constantius Chlorus was always out campaigning, and he got even more busy when he was made Caesar by Diocletian in the 290s. And his father, Constantius, was actually a pretty able general, and he's forgotten in the history books, of course, overshadowed by his great son. But even though Constantius only ruled as Augustus for a year, one must take into consideration that he was a Caesar for a long time before that, and he was, by all accounts, a very able general and administrator, just like his son would be, but even greater. And instead would be raised by his mother, Helena, who, according to some accounts, may or may not have something to do with Constantine's conversion to Christianity.
The years passed, and eventually he received news of his father's promotion as Caesar and his engagement to the emperor's daughter. Still loved by his father, he was sent to Diocletian's court, where he was to learn how to be an emperor from one of the very best.
Oh yeah, I can't think of a better court to learn about the job of being a Roman emperor. Learning from Diocletian, you couldn't really ask for a better mentor than that. And in many ways, Constantine would continue on the legacy of Diocletian with administrative and military reforms, and even currency reforms that all were in line with the spirit of Diocletian.
And in the battlefield, Constantine proved himself a prodigy, crushing barbarian invasions with Diocletian in the Danube, and slaughtering Sassanids under Galerius in the east, gaining the respect, praise, and adoration of all as a natural leader. Returning to Nicomedia, Constantine was present for the Great Persecution, seeing that no matter how many Christians were killed, it never seemed to be enough. He didn't know quite to think of it, but one thing was certain: killing them all didn't seem to work.
Yeah, Constantius and Constantine never really saw any value in the great persecution of the Christians. They really saw it as more disruptive, more than anything, to little or no gain. And both Constantius and Constantine would really do their best just to ignore the persecutions issued by Diocletian, but Galerius is probably the one who really was the driving force behind the persecutions of the Christians.
Diocletian knew greatness when he saw it, and together with Galerius, he feared that Constantine might prove a threat to the Tetrarchic system. So once Diocletian finally resigned, seeking to restore the unfamiliar succession system of the 5 good emperors, he proclaimed neither Constantine nor Maxentius would be Caesars, their talent or obvious villainy not quite the point.
And this was a big mistake, in my opinion, by Diocletian. Now, why he did this is still debated. He might have wanted to break up the old bloodline succession system, but ultimately this was not a good idea, because this left both Constantine and Maxentius, 2 sons of an Augustus, an emperor, without succession rights. And they were very ambitious, both of them, and very capable. Well, at least Constantine was. Maxentius, not so much, as we'll see. This put the seeds of the destruction of the Tetrarchy in motion, so to speak. And the resignation or abdication of Diocletian really meant the end of the Tetrarchy in its stable form. It would continue to persist for a few years afterwards under Galerius, who would be the new most senior Augustus in the East. But Diocletian really was the glue that held the Tetrarchy together, and without him, the things would fall apart pretty quickly, and he's even going to be forced out of retirement briefly, because someone needs to try to stick this thing together again.
And after Diocletian retired to his cabbage farm and Galerius took over, the new Augustus sought to test his co-emperor's son, throwing Constantine into a one-on-one fight against a lion, which he won, then on a hunt of Sarmatians beyond the Danube, returning with the barbarians' heads, thus proving himself. Already an adult, Constantine hooked up with his first love, Minervina, with whom he had his first son, Crispus, named after his great-grandfather.
We'll come back to Crispus in a few decades.
One night, as Galerius was partying, after being asked by both Constantius and Constantine to let father and son reunite, he relented, letting him go and crush the legs of every horse on his way to ensure he would keep going.
Now, at the time when Constantius was elevated to become the new Augustus, because remember, Diocletian was not the only one who abdicated. He forced Maximian to abdicate with him, even though he never really wanted to. Diocletian's authority was such that if he wished it, so it had to be. But at the time, problem was that, as you remember, Constantine was at Diocletian's court in the east. Now it's Galerius's court. Now Constantine wished to join his father and aid him, because he's the new Augustus in the west. But Galerius was very reluctant to let Constantine go, because he recognized that Constantine was very dangerous. He was popular, a natural-born leader, able military man, and so Galerius knew the dangers. But the story goes that during one drunken night, under the constant, persistent begging of Constantine, he was finally able to convince Galerius to let him go while he was drunk. And permission given, Constantine then fled to the court of his father in the west, and he never looked back. So the story goes. Who knows if that's true or not? I think it's more likely, maybe, that Constantine's constant nagging and begging convinced Galerius to just let him go.
After traversing his way west, Constantine was reunited with his father in Bononia, even if it would prove to be for a short while. By the time he was crossing into Britain, he had learned much of the empire he lived on, the heroes that defined it, the fates they met, and the gods they worshipped, all influencing him deeply. Fighting beyond the wall, Constantine almost finished Agricola's legacy, but had to halt, for his father's end was at hand. Marching south to Aboracum, Constantius uttered his last words, declaring his support for Constantine to become an Augustus.
Whether or not he actually did this is somewhat doubtful. Maybe he didn't say anything at all because he was too sick. But the end result would regardless be that the legions under Constantius' command would declare Constantine the new Augustus in the west, despite him having no succession rights, which is going to be a problem for the Tetrarchy.
And then dying. And the legions, in their grief, acclaimed Constantine as Augustus right then and there, to his deep surprise and confusion. Putting his grief aside, he reported everything to Emperor Galerius, and after hearing about the hasty acclamation, Galerius was kinda pissed. But after promoting Severus as the new Western Augustus, needing a new Western Caesar as fast as possible.
Yeah, so Diocletian had appointed Severus and Maximinus as the new Caesars of the East and West, respectively. And instead of Constantine and Maxentius. I'm sorry, there are a lot of names to keep track of during this period. In any case, now that Constantine had been declared Augustus, this was a problematic, as I said, and when Galerius learned of this, he sort of offered a compromise to Constantine. He offered to name him Caesar on the Severus, and upon Severus's death or abdication, Constantine would be elevated to the new Western Augustus. And, Constantine was very smart. He played a long game and didn't, declare a rebellion right there and then to assert his claim. But instead accepted this offer, this compromise. He was looking ahead. He was going to wait for a better opportunity.
Galerius named Constantine as such, leaving him hoping to live up to his father's support. And after that, Hispania declared loyalty to him, since Severus II was so distant if anything, and he would prove himself worthy, defending the empire from both Picts, Franks, and Alemanni, kicking the former beyond the wall, having the Frankish kings thrown to the lions, and having the Alemanni beg for mercy so hard that he had it minted into a coin.
Yeah, Constantine was a very successful general. He and his legions made very short work of various barbarians, such as the Picts, the Franks, and the Alemanni. He even captured some Frankish kings. And very impressive record. And Constantine would go on to crush even more barbarians in the future on the Danube and along other fronts. So, always good to have an emperor capable of defending the Roman heartland from these uncivilized barbarians.
And in Trier, Constantine upgraded the western capital to his standards, ending the Christian persecutions and overseeing the burial of Minervina, who had recently died. Hearing of Constantine's achievements, Maxentius kept bursting in anger, while his sister, Fausta...
Yeah, so here we go. Constantine has been elevated to the rank of Caesar. He now has proper succession rights. He now has legitimacy, which is sort of why Constantine accepted the offer to begin with. And the problem is, Maxentius was not elevated, despite being the son of Maximian. And he was absolutely fuming when he heard that Constantine had been elevated to the Imperial College. And he would soon cause a lot of trouble in Italy.
Stood by listening to his envious bitching. With the Western Augustus now being Severus II, a friend of...
Oh, and Fausta, which we saw in the background there, is the future empress and wife of Constantine.
The Senate hating Eastern Tetrarchs, the senators saw in Maxentius their opportunity to retake power. Every day they fueled his anger and victimization, all heightened by two new announcements Severus II made. One, Rome was now to pay taxes, as did everyone else in the empire. And two, the Praetorian Guard was to be, finally, thank the gods, abolished.
And this is problematic. If you remember, Diocletian had rationalized and standardized the Roman system of taxation and abolished special tax privileges for certain provinces, including Italy. But Rome was the last holdout. Rome was exempted for sentimental reasons, really. And now Severus was coming in and ending Rome's special privilege status once and for all. And this was utterly intolerable to the senatorial elite in Rome, and, of course, announcing the abolishment of the Praetorian Guard is even more unacceptable. And as we already know from previous episodes, the Praetorians do not give up power lightly. And they are not going to take this lying down. So what are they going to do instead? They're gonna find someone with, some legitimacy, Maxentius being the son of an Augustus, to elevate to the imperial purple. To stand against Severus. And Maxentius will actually be pretty successful in the beginning.
The scum of the empire now united in outrage, the Senate and Praetorians acclaimed Maxentius as Augustus, who instantly accepted and promised all of their old powers back. Using the senators and Praetorians, Maxentius took over most of Italy, and awaited Galerius to legitimize his usurpation.
He was trying to pull a Constantine here. Constantine had been declared Augustus by his troops, and as such, Galerius had to offer him this compromise. The only reason that deal worked, though, was because Constantius had just died, and there was an open slot in the Imperial College for Constantine to fit in. But now all 4 slots, the 2 Augusti and the 2 Caesars, have been selected, and there is no vacancies here. So Galerius cannot offer the same deal to Maxentius. And even if he could, offering another such deal would make him look very weak, as ostensibly the most senior Augustus. And so Maxentius waited in vain for Galerius to offer him legitimacy, which he would not. Instead, Galerius would march on Italy. However, Maxentius would prove himself very popular in the city of Rome and in most of Italy, actually, and that would help him cling on to power in Italy for a while.
But when Galerius heard of this, he exploded in rage, immediately sending Severus II with an army to go crush him. But once Severus II arrived in Italy, Maxentius just hid behind the Aurelian walls like the spineless coward he was. Unable to breach it, and with his Maximian veterans being bribed to defect him, Severus gave up trying.
Yeah, Severus was initially sent by Galerius to suppress this uprising, but he found very little support in Italy, and soon his armies started to defect to Maxentius, and Severus was kind of screwed from that point onwards.
And speaking of Maximian, he was still grumbling over in his retirement villa. But when the senatorial and praetorian envoys came in pleading him to return back to power, after pretending to be reluctant, he went right along with them. Now reunited with his own father, Maxentius sent him to go defeat Severus.
Yeah, so Maxentius, he needs to shore up his support among the troops and, gain some legitimacy. And that's why he brought his father out of retirement. Even though he had promised Diocletian to stay out of it, he promptly broke his promise and reunited with his son. Now, those two would fight amongst themselves later on over who would be, supreme. Because Maximian, like I said, he never really gave up on, being Augustus. He never really wanted to give up power, and his son now being declared an Augustus, but he doesn't have a imperial rank. That's not going to sit with him for very long. But yeah, he was sent to deal with Severus, which, at this point, Severus is... he doesn't have much of any forces left.
who had by then camped north in Ravenna. Once Maximian arrived with overwhelming numbers, he promised Severus he would spare his life if he surrendered. Seeing no way out, Severus did just that, and then Maximian killed him. Yeah, Diocletian really was holding it all together, wasn't he?
This was a bad move by Maximian. It really was seen as treacherous and dishonorable and cowardly in many ways, and his popularity suffered as a result.
Now betrayed by his ex-tetrarch, Galerius sighed, leaving the east under the supervision of Licinius, his best friend, while he marched to Italy.
Another name
while
we will
Constantine's
come across.
more dramatic invaders, he received a letter from Maxentius of all cunts begging for his help. And though Constantine refused to betray Galerius, after getting engaged with Fausta, he agreed to be neutral as good faith, with Maximian sent to oversee his succession as Augustus from Severus.
Yeah, this was very common within the Tetrarchy, marrying off their relatives and even siblings to each other to ensure there's some sort of familial connection. And Maxentius, of course, knew that Galerius was coming, and he couldn't deal with Constantine at the same time, and so he married off his sister Fausta to Constantine, and Constantine agreed to stay neutral in this conflict and don't move away from Gaul. And Constantine would instead focus on continuing to beating the shit out of the barbarians.
Since Galerius was rather busy at the moment. Unfortunately, Maxentius had already taken over all of Italy, so Galerius had to carve his way through hostile cities and lack of supplies. Laying siege to Rome, Galerius offered to settle things diplomatically, but Maxentius had shoved his head too far up his own ass for that.
Galerius would encounter the same sort of problems that Severus did during his Italian campaigns. Most of the local population was hostile. The walled cities refused to open their gates to them, and they couldn't get supplies, and they were harassed. And when he finally arrived out of Rome, he couldn't really do anything because the Aurelian walls are in place at this point. And Rome is pretty hard to take. And Maxentius is no fool. He has stocked up the city with African grain, and as such could withstand a long siege. And Galerius couldn't afford to just sit around here forever. And so Galerius was going to be forced to do something else.
Hiding behind the Aurelian walls, again. Bribing the lawful emperor's soldiers, again, thus forcing him to retreat, again. Smug as fuck, Maximian went to oversee Constantine's ascension from Western Caesar to Western Augustus, married him to his daughter Fausta, and all while proclaiming to be the senior Augustus, like Diocletian was. Yeah, he was, so much so that when he met again with Maxentius to discuss their future aspirations, they conflicted so much that they started to fight over who was really in charge.
Yeah. This was a problem because both of them thought the other was going to help them with their objectives. Maximian had some sort of illusions that Maxentius was going to help him be elevated to Augustus again, but Maxentius expected his father, Maximian, to help him to be elevated to the rank of Augustus. And eventually this dispute resulted in a complete falling out of things, and Maximian was forced to flee.
Watching Maxentius getting thrown around, the Praetorian Guard became really mad, forcing Maximian to flee for his life. Back in Nicomedia, as Galerius lamented the current state of the Tetrarchy, he was visited by Maximian, now seeking asylum. I'm not kidding.
Yeah, it's pretty pathetic. Maximian is now forced to flee Rome. He, at one point there, confronts his son and denounced him. But he was not well received by the army, who was completely loyal to Maxentius, because Maxentius is the one who's paying their salaries at this point. So Maximian fled, and he fled to the court of Galerius, of all people. It's pretty pathetic.
He chose Galerius of all emperors. Not a lethal mistake though, as he would prove himself useful for what was to come next. Organizing a meeting of the original Tetrarchs, Galerius...
Yeah. He fled to the court of Galerius. Galerius was like, okay, but he wasn't like happy to receive him or anything, but he was still useful politically, and he's going to use Maximian as a way of forcing Diocletian to come out of retirement so they can discuss how to restore the balance of the Tetrarchy.
Convinced Diocletian to leave his farm for once and talk with his past colleagues. Meeting up in a fort on the Danube, Maximian begged Diocletian to return to power with him, flat out refusing, and saying, "If only you saw the majestic cabbages I was growing back home, you too would give up the pursuit of worldly power."
A very famous quote by, ostensibly by Diocletian. We don't know, of course, if he actually said anything like that. So Maximian and Galerius begged Diocletian to come back to power and restore the balance once again. Diocletian was having none of it, but still, they're going to work out some sort of compromise at this point. But the compromise they worked out without consulting any of the other players involved, like Maxentius and Maximian and I mean Maximinus and Constantine. They weren't consulted here. So it's going to create more problems than it fixes.
Diocletian, cabbage farmer. And after telling Maximian to go back to retirement, Galerius sought approval for his reform of the Tetrarchy. Galerius and Dia would remain as they were. Constantine would be demoted back to Caesar, despite Galerius not having the authority to do that. Maxentius would still be an usurper, and Licinius would be inserted in as the new Western Augustus.
Yeah, you could see the problem here. They decide to elevate Galerius' old friend Licinius to the rank of Western Augustus and demoting Constantine back to the rank of Caesar, and still not recognizing the legitimacy of Maxentius. And it doesn't really solve anything. All it really does is strengthen Galerius' position by appointing his friends and relatives to become Caesar and Augustus. So yeah.
And speaking of the usurper, he was by then brutally crushing revolts, ruling tyrannically and getting hated more and more by the Roman Italians. To recompensate the scorned Westerners, Galerius gave them the title of Son of the Augusti, which both of them refused for very different reasons.
Yeah. This was a vain attempt to purchase their loyalty by giving them some sort of honorary title, Son of Augustus, which doesn't really come with anything. I mean, ostensibly, for Maxentius at least, it comes with some additional political legitimacy, but it's really a title with no meaning in practice.
Which brings us back to Dia, still Caesar of the East and yet now calling himself Augustus as well, making up 5 in total. Having outlived his usefulness to Galerius, Maximian then fled to the court of Constantine in the West, where he was welcomed with respect.
Imagine that. Now he had Maximian had nowhere to go again, and so he was forced to flee to the court of Constantine, who at this point still calls himself Augustus, and he has not relinquished the title, and he would print or mint coins confirming his status as Augustus, and he would never relinquish the title ever again. So him being made Caesar by this compromise worked out by Galerius, Diocletian, and Maximian, it really didn't work out. But still, he was forced to flee to the court of Constantine. Constantine actually accepted him because, he had some political value still as a former Augustus. And being the father of Maxentius, he definitely had some leverage going here.
Constantine then gave Maximian some legions to keep an eye on Maxentius in the Alps, while he went to crush more Germans on the Rhine. And the minute Constantine went away, Maximian told everyone Constantine had died, and that they all should acclaim him as Augustus, the senior Augustus, which everyone called bullshit on, sending word to Constantine about it, forcing him to abandon his campaign.
Yeah, when Constantine went off campaigning against the Franks and the Alemanni again, Maximian tried to take this opportunity to declare himself Augustus and, start a usurpation. But the troops were loyal to Constantine, and, besides the fact that Constantine had been the son of Constantius, he also was the one paying their salaries again. and they had very little reason to betray Constantine at this point. Also, the population of the territories that Constantine administered was very happy with the rule of Constantine, who really took great care of the civilian population too. So yeah, it was a doomed attempt, and it is the end of Maximian, finally.
After failing to bribe them to his side, Maximian then fled for his life again, eventually hiding in Massalia, modern Marseilles or however you pronounce that. Constantine then arrived, was allowed in with no problems, hunted down Maximian and spared him, telling him not to do something stupid again, which was just the last straw for Maximian. After a lifetime of failures, he would prove himself competent by killing his own son-in-law. After implicating his daughter Fausta in the murder, he sneaked into Constantine's room and stabbed him to death. Only that the Constantine he killed was a decoy, placed by Fausta, who had already alerted Constantine, having Maximian apprehended, earning her the Emperor's trust.
Yeah, so that's how the story goes, that it was Fausta who alerted Constantine of Maximian's plot to assassinate him. But this was uncovered, and he replaced himself with a eunuch in his bed. And so when Maximian did the deed, he was caught red-handed.
Failure once again, Maximian was told by Constantine to just go kill himself, which he did, hanging himself to death.
Yeah, and it's really important that he did it in that way, because killing a former Augustus, a legitimate former Augustus, would not look good in the eyes of the other Caesars and Augustuses in the Tetrarchy. So Constantine instead strongly encouraged Maximian to commit suicide, which he did. And Constantine would then go around saying it was a tragedy, it was a tragic incident, and it was not his fault, and the usual. But it worked, ostensibly.
One of the few things he set out to do on his own, and achieved successfully. Finally able to sleep in peace, Constantine experienced a divine vision. Brought to a spiritual realm, the two divine aspects, Apollo and Victoria, emerged, gifting him a laurel wreath and proclaiming he would rule long and with health. And once awake, his piety went even further beyond. The gods of the sun and victory appearing was no coincidence. The more he thought about it, the clearer the truth of a grander monotheistic god appeared, known to all Romans as Deus Sol Invictus. While in the east, Galerius met the same fate as Diocletian, suffering from a disease so bad that the stench of his...
Yeah, so that dream is a very famous account of how Constantine is getting closer and closer to a monotheistic way of thinking about religion. And so he sort of embraces Sol Invictus like Aurelian had done. And this is the start of his process to officially converting to Christianity. Of course, this dream probably didn't happen. It's probably a thing that was made up by Constantine when he was the sole emperor, when he was free to exert the power of his propaganda machine, as is very common with Roman emperors. But it makes for a nice story, doesn't it? And yes, Galerius was apparently at this point in 311, he was suffering from some sort of terrible disease, and he was confined to a bath, and he smelled really bad. He also smelled like he was dying. And Galerius was actually he's the one who initiated really the great persecution of the Christians. And on his deathbed, he revokes the persecution. Which, good on him, I guess. It's sort of a thing you do on your deathbed, I guess. Revoke the great persecution of your religious rivals, or whatever you want to call them.
Rotting organs were smelled all across Nicomedia. As his final act, he declared the great persecution a failure, proclaiming an end to it, and then dying, painfully. Dia then re-emerged.
Yeah. So, with Galerius dead, Maximinus Dia will, ostensibly be the new Augustus in the east, and he doesn't actually follow the end of the persecution edict that was issued by Galerius. He will continue the persecutions. And now it's a foot race on who can claim Asia Minor first. Will it be Maximinus Daia, or will it be Licinius? Who knows?
Taking over Galerius' possessions and even his court, imprisoning both Diocletian's wife and daughter. For as it turns out, Daia was a huge cunt. When news of it all reached Diocletian, it struck him hard. The Tetrarchy he had created was in ruins. His family was imprisoned, and every single one of his friends were now gone.
Yeah, so Diocletian here appealed directly to have his wife and other relatives stuck at Maximinus's court released. But nobody would listen to this old man anymore. Time had outrun him. He was a relic, and he spent his last day, pretty irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. People had moved on now.
Gone. Thinking it was all his fault, he hanged himself in his palace, saying goodbye to this doomed world. After his death, Licinius did the same as Daia, seizing Galerius' past domains and setting their border between the Bosphorus Strait, leaving both of them unsatisfied.
Yeah, so they met, Licinius and Maximinus Daia met, and at the Hellespont, and they made a new division of the empire. And ostensibly, they were also made allies for about 12 seconds before Licinius would make an alliance with Constantine. But yeah, civil war at this point is now inevitable. And there's already been some sort of proto-civil war going on, with Maxentius holding the whole of Italy, really. And has been doing so for the past, 6 years almost at this point.
And fuck pleb, now the empire was truly divided between 4 Augusti, only 2 of which were legitimate, the western ones being polar opposites, and the eastern ones despising each other. The absolute state. No wonder Diocletian killed himself. By far the worst of them was Maxentius, who, despite hating his father, proclaimed he would avenge him by declaring war on Constantine.
Yeah, so Maxentius needed a casus belli, a reason for war. And so he conveniently used the excuse of avenging his father's death, because he claimed that Constantine had him killed and all that. And now he must avenge his father by campaigning against Constantine. It is all bullshit, really. But, it was a useful political excuse for it.
Out of nowhere, throwing the Tetrarchy into civil war. Receiving this news, Constantine vowed to remove the tyrant Maxentius from Rome, for God and empire. Oh, and by the way, it's about time I told you that Constantius' second marriage rendered his son 6 half-siblings: Julius, Dalmatius, Constantia, Eutropia, Anastasia, and Fausta. And no, don't give me that look. We've only begun with the name dumps. This is the Constantinian dynasty, you pleb. Get used to it. Constantine
The problem with the Constantine dynasty is that we have lots of Constantines, Constantius, Constantinas, all variations of the name Constantine, who is going to succeed Constantine the Great. And it's going to become really confusing, especially when there's going to be a civil war between all of them. But that's a story for the next video.
Started out allying himself with Licinius against Maxentius, promising his sister Constantia's hand in marriage.
Yeah, so this was a move by Constantine to preempt an alliance between Maxentius and Licinius by allying himself with Licinius now, before Maxentius could make a move, and he married his half-sister Constantia to Licinius. And here again we show how Constantine is really playing the long game, he's really being smart politically, he is keeping out of all of these other disputes going on in the Tetrarchy, and just waiting for that perfect moment, and he's going to get it right about now.
Which provoked Daia into recognizing Maxentius' rule if he allied with him, which he agreed to. It was all now a team deathmatch. Preparing for the war, Constantine's advisor recommended him to stay in the defensive, for whether if Maxentius attacked or stayed out, his defeat was imminent. Constantine agreed, which is why he proclaimed his intent to invade Italy.
Yeah, Constantine's advisors at this point are telling him to stay in Gaul, let Maxentius come to him, because he will be fighting on his own territory, fighting a defensive battle, which will eventually just exhaust the resources of Maxentius. And either way, he's going to win by this strategy, which he... and there were omens saying that he should not go on the offensive, he should stay in Gaul. But Constantine would have none of that, and he immediately proclaimed his intention to invade Italy, which is sort of a bold move considering how poorly it had gone for both Severus and Galerius just a few years prior. But he correctly recognized, Constantine did, that Maxentius was no longer popular in Italy. In order to maintain his grip on Italy and his grip on power, he had to maintain a large standing army. And he only had direct control over North Africa and Italy. And as such, he had to raise taxes constantly in order to keep the army loyal, to keep the army in the field at all. And now he was quite unpopular, and he was only just barely tolerated as an emperor. And Constantine recognizes this, of course, and he's going to exploit this, and by invading Italy itself.
Telling everyone to start packing. Constantine then crossed the Alps with 40,000 men, only a quarter of his total army, still mainly focused on defending his citizens from barbarians as he was.
Because the fact that Constantine has to maintain the borders of his Gallic provinces, he can only bring a quarter of his army to Italy, 40,000. And Severus and Galerius had both brought bigger armies and still failed. And he knows that Maxentius far outnumbers him in Italy. So he is kind of in a poor position just by looking at it in terms of numbers. But Constantine is called the Great for a reason.
While in Rome, Maxentius ordered the patricians to build him a huge basilica in his honor, but he was too lazy to actually finish it, instead sending his minions to go fight his war for him. And
the Basilica of Maxentius was a really impressive basilica, and it's the last basilica, I think, that is built in Rome. And it was very big for the time. It was probably the world's largest freestanding building. But it still exists today. Not much of it, but some parts of it do still exist today. And the basilica would eventually be co-opted by Constantine when he conquers the city. Spoiler alert. And he's gonna, make it his own building project instead of Maxentius.
As he entered Italy, Constantine was halted at Sigusium, which he dealt with by setting its walls on fire and then scaling them, taking it with ease, and forbidding any looting, showing to all his benevolence.
This was a really huge move. During the siege, he took the city quickly, but importantly, he ordered his men not to loot and sack the city, which proved his benevolence to all of Italia. And this would make it very easy for him in the future of this Italian campaign. Cities would not oppose him anymore. They would open the gates to him, and they would actually welcome him into their midst. And considering that Maxentius was not very popular, you could see why. But they wouldn't have opened their gates if Constantine had burned and sacked the city. And in this way, he followed the example of Aurelian, who did the same thing while he was campaigning in the east against the Palmyrene Empire. By sparing the city, he was able to gain easy access to supplies, and he would bring lots of cities over to his cause willingly. So he didn't have to spend time sieging down every fortress along the way and every city. So again, a very smart political move by Constantine, which will help him militarily later on.
Maxentius then responded by sending a huge cavalry army to attack them near Turin, which, astoundingly, Constantine encircled with his foot soldiers, descending on it and dismounting the riders to their deaths.
Extremely impressive.
What few survived then fled to Turin, and were refused entry by the locals, who then happily opened their gates to Constantine. After that, more and more cities surrendered to him, and he was then cheerfully welcomed into Mediolanum as a liberator. After resting, Constantine marched east to face a huge Maxentian army, led by his Praetorian prefect, which was camped out on the heavily fortified fortress of Verona, covered in 3 sides by rivers.
Yeah, Verona is a very heavily fortified city because it's surrounded by the Adige River on 3 sides. And so it was a very hard city to take, in theory. Constantine's going to do it pretty quickly.
And to cross the river, Constantine sent a tiny detachment of cavalry to scout the area, which the prefect noticed, sending a way bigger army to quash the attempt, and getting crushed instead. Constantine then laid siege to Verona, allowing the prefect to flee, and returned with an even bigger army.
Now, why is this possible? Well, what has Constantine been doing these last few years? He's been campaigning constantly in Brittany and in Gaul against various barbarian tribes, and so his men are very experienced. And as we know from past incidents and battles in Roman history, we know that experience counts for a whole damn lot. It is the reason Caesar wins his civil war against Pompey's larger army, and yeah, having experienced troops really pays off. And it really did for Constantine in this instance.
To which Constantine sent one tiny battalion to fight off. The insulted prefect then attacked, got his entire army destroyed, and died in battle. Oh man, it's hard not to laugh. After this show of force, Verona just surrendered to Constantine, and later all remaining cities in North Italy did so as well. Now more terrified than ever, Maxentius abandoned his people.
You know, when I think about it, Constantine is really following in the footsteps of Caesar here by being so generous with his clemency and mercy that wins him more friends than any military victory would have won.
Hoarding all of his troops and resources into Rome, destroying all bridges on the Tiber and hoping the Aurelian walls would save him again. Constantine was then cheered on as he approached Rome, camping nearby where the Milvian Bridge once stood.
Maxentius, had demolished all the bridges across the Tiber to Rome, and he had stocked up the city again with African grain, and so all he really had to do was sit in Rome. But his situation is becoming more precarious this time around because he doesn't have the same internal support from the citizens and the upper classes that he had once, and he's going to be forced to confront Constantine head-on, which is a death sentence.
And while he threw games as a distraction, the crowd started cheering for Constantine, declaring him to be invincible. Fitting, as for around then, Constantine gathered his men for a march that would change the fate of the world. As they marched, Constantine's vision was taken over by a radiant beam of light from the sky. Over the light of the sun, a gigantic symbol had manifested in the sky, beneath a divine commandment. In hoc signo vincis. By this sign, conquer. The entire army has shared the vision, but once it vanished, not even Constantine knew what to really make of it.
Another famous apocryphal story about Constantine's road to Christianity. This is perhaps the most famous story from Constantine's life. The cross, the Chi-Rho that appears in the sky with the command to conquer by this sign. It's a really good story. Unfortunately, it's just Constantinian propaganda made up to, legitimize, and it was very handy to make up this story after the fact. But it's a good story.
Later that day, going to sleep and praying for answers, he experienced another vision. As lucid as ever, he woke up in an even grander divine realm, and again, he wasn't alone. Beside him was someone he knew, yet didn't understand. He was all of the gods of Roman tradition, and yet beyond them. The Logos in the flesh, the Alpha and the Omega, Sol Invictus, and even more. Before him stood the one true God. And now he appeared to Constantine as Jesus Christus, the dead Judaistic himself. And what at first sounded insane now made more sense than anything. Sol Invictus, Jesus Christus, different interpretive aspects of the same overarching deity.
This is something the Romans did a lot. Religion was very important to the Romans, but they usually did it this way. When they adopted the Greek pantheon of Zeus and all of those gods of Greek mythology, they didn't see them as different gods. They were just the same gods as the Roman pantheon. But they were fused, almost. Different interpretations of who they were and their names. But in the end, they're the same. And it's the same thing here. Sol Invictus is the greatest god, as is Jesus Christ. And they are both the same, but they're just interpreted differently. And it's that it is in this way the conversion of Constantine to Christianity makes sense, because it seems to come out of the fly, but it really doesn't when you look at it this way.
And as the revelation shined light on many old questions, the true God again stood before him, telling Constantine to bear the first two letters of Christus's name as his symbol and that of his allegiance, to which he accepted and returned to the mortal realm. And once he woke up, Constantine got straight out of bed and started hunting down for a shitload of paint. The next morning, Maxentius celebrated his 6th anniversary since his usurpation, and Rome's priests told him that the enemy of Rome would be defeated that very day.
Another funny apocryphal story. He consulted the oracles and, the soothsayers about how this battle was going to end, and they said the enemy of Rome would die today. And Maxentius really took it to heart. I mean, that's a clear sign he's going to win, right? Constantine's going to die this day. Unfortunately, it was he who was going to die this day. He probably never could have imagined that outcome.
Surprised with joy, Maxentius ordered his troops out of the city to finally face Constantine. And since he had destroyed the Milvian Bridge earlier, Maxentius ordered his men to build a temporary bridge to cross the Tiber. As he finished the crossing, Constantine's army appeared in the distance, and Maxentius could not believe what he saw.
A divine army, blessed by God, the Kai roll.
Constantine ordered his cavalry to charge and annihilate Maxentius' cavalry, and marched his legions forward. Despite heavily outnumbered, Constantine pushed them further and further backwards to the Tiber River. His will to fight already broken, Maxentius ordered a retreat back to the Aurelian walls, and what ensued was pure chaos. Tens of thousands of soldiers panicked, crossing at the same time.
Never fight with the back against the river.
Maxentius was pushed out of the bridge and drowned in the Tiber River, along with many of his men. And at the end of the day, Rome's enemy had died, and with this sign, Constantine had conquered. Victorious, Constantine was welcomed in Rome with a triumph, displaying Maxentius' severed head. But as he did, he refrained from going to the temple of Jupiter, now truly understanding the grander divinity he represented. Instead, he went to the Senate, where the senators implored their master for mercy, proclaiming him the senior and greatest Augustus. And he let them be, for his ire was directed to the other parasites.
We're going to talk about, hopefully, Constantine's administrative reforms, but he has plans for the old aristocracy in the Senate, and he has a plan to reintegrate them into the imperial order.
Seeing his merciful attitude, the Praetorians judged Constantine as yet another emperor they could exploit, and awaited to be bribed to ensure their loyalty. just waiting for an opportunity to betray him in the future. However, the time had finally
The time has come, boys.
The time for a new age. The time for revenge. And so Constantine proclaimed that the Praetorian Guard would be
abolished. Finally. What a shad, abolishing the Praetorians. A sign of approval from his great imperial predecessors. Praetoriae delenda est. The Praetorians must die.
It took hundreds of years, but now Rome's betrayed emperors could finally rest in peace.
Now, while the end of the Praetorians was certainly a welcome development, and never again would a bodyguard unit be so treacherous like the Praetorians, nevertheless, imperial bodyguard units would continue to play a huge role in Roman politics. We will have the Palatine Guards, we will have the Excubitors, the Varangians. There will be many other iterations of the Praetorian Guard, but never again would we see such blasphemous treachery by these Praetorian scum. And Constantine did the world a favor by abolishing them.
With Constantine's deeds forever immortalized in the triumphal arch he then built in Rome. Displaying both his pagan and Christian beliefs, Constantine issued currency bearing Sol Invictus and in others the Cairo, which he now understood as both sides of the same coin. Constantine then met with Licinius in Mediolanum, married him to his sister as promised, and together they issued the Edict of Milan, officially legalizing Christianity in the Roman Empire, although only one of them actually meant it.
The Edict of Milan is a turning point in history. It is the start of Christianization of the Roman Empire, and by extension, the Western world. Christianity from this point onwards is free to expand and grow, and its influence on Roman politics from here on out is unimaginable, and of course, by extent, the influence of Christianity on Western civilization is... one cannot put into word how influential Christianity has been in shaping the world many of us live in. And I should say, though, that the Edict of Milan is not an edict that made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. It is a decriminalization of Christianity and all other religions, sects, and cults within the empire. Because, from Constantine's point of view, this was he could have been an act of genuine faith, because he is a Christian at this point. And it can also be a politically sound thing to do, because it eliminates much of the dissent and dissatisfaction bubbling beneath the surface, especially by the Christians. And one could argue that the Edict of Milan contributed to overall stability of the empire. And it is an edict that has been much discussed by scholars throughout the ages, and whether or not this was an act of genuine faith or a political realist thing to do. But nevertheless, the result is the same. And another thing important with the Edict of Milan is what it also was a restitution of Christian property that had been confiscated in the past. And as such, it was a bit slanted towards Christianity, but it is misunderstood as a legalization. No, it's more like a decriminalization of Christianity, and it is not an endorsement of it. It's a state religion. Christianity would become the state religion of the empire in 380 by the Edict of Thessalonica, I think. Might be wrong. 380 anyways. That's the date. So, from this point onwards, Christianity is a force to be reckoned with.
But when Dia heard of Maxentius' defeat, he was way...
Oh yeah, and Licinius agreed to this move, but didn't really... He wasn't as eager as Constantine was about making this happen.
Back in the Syrian desert and immediately marched west. On his way, he continued persecuting Christians non-stop, in clear violation of the Edict of Milan. Nevertheless, Constantine said he would pardon him if he vowed to follow the law from now on, which Dia refused, gathering some 70,000 men, crossing the Bosphorus and taking Byzantium. Suddenly forced into another civil war, Constantine had no time to reinforce Licinius' army before he marched off. So to boost their spirits, Licinius was then visited by an angel, which handed him a prayer that would work for all interpretations of the one true God, be it Jupiter, Sol, Yahweh, whatever. His speech given, Licinius faced Dia's overwhelming numbers at Zeralum, the city where Aurelian had once been betrayed decades back. Confident in his numbers, Dia just stayed in the defensive, knowing that Licinius' men would soon give up. Eventually, their incessant attacking proved him wrong, but too late for him by then. As his army was crushed, he crossed the Bosphorus Strait, fleeing to Anatolia. Making a last stand, Dia larped as Probus and fortified himself in the Cilician gates against Licinius, who didn't actually bother facing him in person, sending his legions alone, who then crushed Dia's forces anyway. Fleeing to Tarsus, in his last moments, he then larped as Galerius, proclaiming an end to the persecutions, accepting the Edict of Milan, and then dying, also painfully. Now in charge over the Eastern Empire, the vices of power made Licinius show his true colors. With that, he massacred Dia's entire family, executed Severus' second son for being a friend of his, and then hunted down Diocletian's wife and daughter, murdering them both. Hearing of this horrific carnage from afar, Constantine's alliance with Licinius immediately began deteriorating.
Yeah, when Licinius and Constantine had gotten rid of all the other players, Maxentius, Maximian, Diocletian, Galerius, Maximinus, Dia, now, when it was only the two of them left, it was sort of inevitable at this point they would turn on each other, because it has not been an alliance born out of friendship or common trust, and none of that. It was an alliance of, realist alliance, which had in mind to clear certain objectives, the deposition of Maxentius and Maximinus Dia and all that. But now when those goals were achieved, well, both of them will fight for the supremacy of the empire, who will become the one, the only Augustus. And the war will soon begin.
And as that happened, Armenia had gotten a new king again, a Christian this time, who then proclaimed Christianity as Armenia's state religion, outlawing all other pagan interpretations of God, a premonition if there ever was one. And talking of Christianity, Constantine was facing the greatest threat to Christianity's success, Christ-cookery. More precisely, the tendency of Christians to engage in petty squabbles over abstract garbage to the detriment of unity, law, and order. You see, Aurelian was the first Roman emperor to dabble into Christian issues by their own request, and now being Constantine's turn, he was asked to resolve the Donatist issue regarding the Christians that had complied with the persecutions. And the Donatists would keep asking for more and more favors, so getting on his nerve that Constantine demanded them to fucking shut up, which they eventually did. As the years passed, Fausta would bear Constantine's 6 children.
Yeah, so Constantine is the first Roman emperor who would really get involved in the religious dispute of the Christian church. And it would set a precedent, because in the future, it is the emperor who is the ultimate enforcer of church doctrine, the one who's supposed to make sure that everyone follows what is agreed upon by the religious leaders. He's the one who is supposed to root out heresy and, be overall and the enforcer of the Christian church. And the emperor would convene several councils, Christian councils, to settle church doctrine, to settle disputes, interpretations of various aspects of the faith. And in this way, the emperors of Rome would gain an enormous amount of influence over religious policy as well. And, some were more successful than others, but this is the precedent set by the Donatist controversy, which Constantine was asked to resolve as the Roman emperor, and he did. And like I said, it set a precedent for things going forward, where many an emperor, like Justinian, would struggle to resolve disputes between various Christians and doctrinal factions.
Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constance, plus another 3 girls, Constantina, Elena, and Fausta. But
I told you the names here are very confusing. Constantine II, Constantius II, Constance, Constantina.
And Constantia also bore a child with Licinius as well, Licinius II. This will be one fucked family tree for a while. And with so many potential heirs, Constantine proposed to revive Diocletian's Tetrarchy. Sending Julius to speak with Licinius, Constantine then married Anastasia to Bassianus, a friend of Senecio, who was BFFs with Licinius, proposing to elevate him as Caesar alongside Crispus, Constantine's now grown eldest son, to which Licinius refused outright, later ordering Senecio to order Bassianus to go and murder Constantine in his sleep. However, Bassianus hadn't been the first one to try that, completely failing in his plot and getting executed for the attempt. And when Constantine demanded Senecio to be handed over for judgment, Licinius refused.
Yeah, this is what sparks the conflict between, or civil war between Constantine and Licinius. It is an assassination attempt by someone pretty closely related to Licinius. Now, whether Licinius or not, ordered it or not is another story, one which can be debated. But the fact remains that Constantine was almost assassinated by one of Licinius's men. And so, from that point onwards, they were going to turn on each other.
Tearing down all of Constantine's statues in his realm, and thus declaring war. And wait a second here, the empire was now split west and east among 2 men with family ties who hated each other on the precipice of civil war? Well, if God wants to replay the Augustus arc so bad, he can't blame me for already knowing who the Livia of this story is. So yeah, Constantine then led a force of 20,000 men over the Alps into Illyria, and Licinius gathered 35,000 men and marched west. They finally clashed in Pannonia, where the infantry clashed for hours, Constantine flanked and destroyed the enemy forces, and Licinius just fled in the dark of night. Fleeing to the east, Licinius raised one of his generals, Valens, as his co-Augustus to ensure his loyalty. Remember that name, it's kinda confusing. After declining a peace treaty, getting fucked on the battlefield, and escaping again, it was only after encircling Constantine to no avail that he felt secure enough to negotiate. Constantine then forced Licinius to recognize him as the senior Augustus, took everything west of Thrace, and had Valens executed. That done, Constantine then formed a new tetrarchy on his own, elevating Crispus and Constantine II as Caesars, with Licinius II added in as another 5th wheel.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Constantine's attempt to reconstruct some sort of tetrarchy suffers really from the same problems as the original tetrarchy, in that the one who creates it, the glue that keeps it all together, that is, in this case, Constantine. When Constantine is dead, the tetrarchy will immediately fall apart, because the central authority figure is no longer there to settle disputes and to keep them all in check, as was been the case with the first tetrarchy with Diocletian.
He then moved his capital to Sirmium so he could keep an eye on Licinius up close, sending Crispus to go defend the west from barbarians in his name, protecting Gaul from 3 massive Germanic invasions, and being as talented as his father, Crispus became just as loved and admired by all. And back to Licinius, he disobeyed his own edict and started persecuting Christians again, plain just ignoring that whole angel thing, I guess. As he wasted his time on that, Constantine was defending the Danube from both Goths and Sarmatians, crushing them both in battle and even killing the new Gothic king before he caused much trouble. Thing is, the barbarians began invading through Licinius' side instead, forcing Constantine to constantly cross the border and clean up the mess. And instead of helping him defend his citizens, he declared war on Constantine again.
Yeah, so now we see Constantine engage on the Danubian frontier, and he would be back later on in his reign. But now we're going for the final struggle between Constantine and Licinius.
Gathering 165,000 men to fight Constantine's 130,000. Fortifying himself beside the river by Adrianople, Licinius also betrayed civilization and recruited a huge Gothic horde to serve him. Constantine, however, bound a whole Frankish horde into his service, binding them with the divine magic of his Cairo standard. Facing Licinius, Constantine found a good spot to cross the river, ordering a bridge to be built far away as a distraction. And once Licinius fell for the bait, Constantine crossed and flanked his lines, pushing him back and casting his standard's divine magic on his own legions, blasting them with so much power he made Licinius flee again, this time to Byzantium, naming yet another general as co-emperor, some dude named Martinian, who he then sent east to gather a new army for him. And despite being injured, Constantine pressed on. But after realizing just how fucking hard it was to siege Byzantium, he ordered his son Crispus.
Oh yes, Constantine would quickly realize the value of Byzantium, and this is a terribly hard city to take, and it would remain terribly difficult to take in the future. Although Byzantium would no longer exist, of course, and it would be renamed to something more in line with Constantine's wishes. I wonder what name that could be.
Back from the west to lead his naval campaign. Sent to face Licinius' fleet while vastly outnumbered in battle, not only did Crispus win decisively, but God then sent a storm to destroy the remaining ships.
The power of the Cairo standard.
After this catastrophe, Licinius then fled to Anatolia and was pursued by Constantine all the way to Chrysopolis. So desperate he became that he started praying to Jupiter and company for help, despite them being derivative of the god he had so recently scorned. So desperate, in fact, he grew to fear Constantine's divine standard above everything else, forbidding his troops to attack in its direction or to even look at it. Resorting to just charging his Goths at him, Constantine ordered one massive charge forward, killing tens of thousands and making Licinius flee one final time. And after fleeing to Nicomedia, Licinius sent his wife Constantia to go plead for his life, which he did, and as Constantine couldn't deny his sister's request, Licinius was allowed to live, being imprisoned in Thessalonica and Martinian in Cappadocia. But
yeah, here again we see that Constantine is just, his troops are just superior, and his leadership is just much better, and he's a much greater general than any of these supposed tetrarchs and other Augusti and Caesars.
Soon after, he was set free by his adolescent son Licinius, and together they conspired with the Goths to link him together with their hordes and then kill Constantine, but getting caught in the attempt. And for having conspired with barbarians against their emperor, plus all of their other crimes, they were both hanged to death, leaving Constantine as the sole emperor of the whole empire. And with said empire now reunited and at peace, Constantine focused on amending its relationship with Christianity. It was no wonder why past emperors persecuted them so much, but with it now revealed as a true faith, Constantine began integrating them as proper citizens. To rule an empire at peace, Constantine chose to favor Christianity as his favorite faith, becoming the first Christian emperor in history.
Yeah, and like I said before, the subject of Constantine's conversion to Christianity is hotly debated still. Whether this was an act of genuine faith or whether he did this because of political motives. I think, and I tend to lean to the argument that Constantine's conversion was in fact genuine, and this is seen by the fact that he, for the rest of his reign, continued to favor the Christians and Christianity. He built many basilicas and churches. He elevated Christians to important imperial offices, and on the whole did a lot of good for the Christian cause, so much so that he would be hailed as Saint Constantine by the Orthodox Church. Yeah, so you could see how this argument would bear weight. Of course, there was probably political motives. I mean, Constantine was a smart man, and he realized there were benefits in accepting Christianity and embracing it and all that. So, it probably wasn't all for altruistic motives.
A wise move given how fast Christianity was spreading, and seeing the writing on the wall, Constantine acted appropriately. Persecuted Christians were recompensated for their losses, their leaders allowed entry into the government, and the declining pagan institutions, though still entirely legal and respected, were placed second to Christianity. By distancing them from Hebrew and into Latin, by fully integrating them into the empire as citizens and governors, Christianity became an increasingly Roman faith, and eventually a civilizing faith. And to appease the increasingly Christian masses, Constantine built countless churches left and right, among them the original St. Peter's Cathedral.
Yes, the original St. Peter's Basilica, the old St. Peter's Basilica, it was located on the same site that today's Vatican City is, and today's St. Peter's Basilica, the new one, of course. So yeah, the legacy of Constantine is still very much alive. And he will also build the Church of the Holy Apostles in the new capital, Byzantium, which goes by another name. We cannot reveal that name, that would be too spoilery. And the Church of the Holy Apostles, while it doesn't exist today, there does exist an important religious building, the great mosques of Istanbul. I don't remember the name of the mosque, but it still exists on the same site where the Church of the Holy Apostles were.
Built over where Nero had executed him, if only to send a message. All that said, Constantine had absolutely no patience for Christ's cookery in his empire, and he was about to face a big one, the Arian heresy.
The Arian heresy is such a complicated, convoluted, and long-lasting conflict within the Christian church that I don't want to get into it here. It's just going to become confusing, and in any case, I'm not a theologian, I'm not an expert. It does concern the whole Holy Trinity matter of the Father, the Holy Spirit, and the Son, and Constantine would try to deal with this by summoning the First Council of Nicaea, which issued the Nicene Creed, in which the Father and the whole concept of the Holy Trinity was sort of established.
It had all to do with a Christian autism called the Trinity. Get this, God is apparently the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who are somehow not each other. Not that far from Constantine's true Trinity, to be honest, but let's do this the Christian way from now on. But that wasn't Arius' contention though. He accepted the Trinity as a concept. He just decided to be a divisive cunt by proclaiming, loudly, that the Son was inferior to the Father, when the standard thought was that they were equal, co-substantial. Now Constantine really didn't give a shit about any of that, but he was really annoyed to see it become the extremely divisive issue in the church it became.
And the issue of the Arian heresy will not be resolved under Constantine's reign, even though, he did try. This issue will last for a long time. Even Justinian had to deal with it, so yeah, it's not going away.
Seeing how petty this conflict was, and with the empire's religious unity at stake, Constantine proclaimed a global council of bishops would be held in Nicaea to settle the matter. The First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. Hundreds of bishops attended.
These sort of councils, like I said before, would become quite common, and it was always the emperor who summoned these councils to solve some sort of doctrinal dispute. And the First Council of Nicaea is, of course, one of the most influential councils in the history of Christianity, really. And there would be many more very important councils that settled doctrinal issues, like the Council of Chalcedon under the Emperor Justinian's reign, for example.
Overseen and mediated by Constantine himself. Tempers flared, fights broke out, but with the emperor's gaze upon them, they all unanimously decided, but for 2 votes, that Arianism was indeed heresy, ending with the unrelenting Arius getting banished to Illyria. and in exile, Arius suffered the fate of a divisive heretic, suddenly getting diarrhea, running for the bathroom, falling, getting a hemorrhage, and dying in a pool of his own piss and shit. Which then takes us to Crispus, who by being a war hero, as well as the spitting image of his father, but younger, his stepmother Fausta was taken over with lust for him, leading her to try and seduce Crispus one night. But Crispus rejected her with disgust, thus pushing her to live up to the other stepmother stereotype, to get her revenge, and to secure her own son's ascension to power. Knowing that magic wouldn't work on Constantine, Fausta claimed that Crispus had tried to rape her and was plotting to murder him. Believing her and completely devastated, Constantine then had his eldest son seized, tried, and executed.
Yes, the execution of Crispus, and spoiler alert, later Fausta, is shrouded in a bunch of secrecy, I wouldn't say it, but it's shrouded in mystery. We don't really know why Crispus and Fausta was executed. This is the story that has been spread by some later sources, very unreliable sources, it should be said. And scholars agree that this is probably not how it went. It might have some truth in it, but probably not. And it's a great unknown, a mystery, exactly what happened to precipitate this. And yeah, here, this is one theory that has been described in the sources.
But the pain of losing his beloved son wouldn't lessen. For while visiting his mother Helena in Rome, as he lamented his loss, she told him the truth, that Fausta had lied to him.
And concerning Helena, it is said in some versions of the story that Helena is the one who converted Constantine. Other sources said it was Constantine who convinced Helena to convert to Christianity. Who knows?
Now angrier than ever before, Constantine threw Fausta into a bath in Rome and cranked up the heat until she suffocated to death. Now deprived of both enemies and loved ones, that weren't Crispus, Constantine focused back on the empire, with its capital particularly in mind. It had long become a cesspool of degeneracy, its political and economical influence diminished away, and its strategic position grown more and more an issue. What the empire needed for a capital was a centrally located city, like in between continents, had a nice harbor, like in between two different seas, was close enough to volatile borders, like the Danube, and was so easily defensible that it could just build one massive wall on one of its sides and defend it for over 1,000 years. Byzantium. It needed Byzantium. Here, near where his Trojan ancestors once stood, where his mentor Diocletian recently ruled, and right beside where the greatest emperor Aurelian was assassinated, Constantine was visited by an archangel, who confirmed this was where he was to build his new city. Constantine thus proclaimed the birth of a second Rome, a new Rome, Nova Roma, or as it was eventually named, the city of Constantine, Constantinople.
Constantinople is, of course, still exists today, although, and it's retained the name of Constantinople right until the early 20th century, when the new Turkish Republic renamed it Istanbul. Shame on you. Anyways, Constantinople would become the great metropolis of the world. It would be the greatest city on the face of the planet for hundreds, if not 1,000 years. It really was something special. At its height, it was as big as Rome was, and it was really the height of Roman civilization. The location of Constantinople was, of course, strategical. It situates in the middle of the entire empire. It also is close to the Danubian frontier, which was becoming more and more unstable. It is situated between two seas, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which meant that from Constantinople one could monitor the trade flows and take out taxes, for example, between trade with the Black Sea and the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus, of course. And Constantine rightly recognized the waning influence of the western half of the empire. The real business was going to happen in the east from now on. And so a capital more closely situated in the richer eastern parts of the empire would be more beneficial, and it was also to recognize the increasing threat posed by the Sassanid Empire, and so the emperor would be now closer to the eastern border provinces and more able to respond to the threats posed by the Persians. And it really would become a cultural center, a center of learning, and really, like I said, one of the great metropolises in world history.
And after helping delineate its borders, the Archangel vanished, and Constantine officially transformed Constantinople into the empire's new capital. And
it should be said that Rome had been declining in importance and influence for a long time now, and it was recognized by many an emperor that Rome was not really that important anymore. And Constantine just ripped off the band-aid, really, and had the capital officially transferred to Constantinople.
Emulating Romulus so much, he returned to emulating Augustus's miserable last years as one of the longest reigning emperors of all time. During his last years, he reinstituted the spirit of the Lex Julia, severely punishing any and all degenerate behavior, most especially in his new capital, using biblical scripture to drill it into every Christian pleb's heads. And in that vibe, he sent his virtuous mother Helena to a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, returning with the pieces of the true cross, the very stick the dead Jew was on. Using all of his funds, he finished his new capital, and even created a new senate for it. He had thousands of senators and was just as useless as the one back in.
Now, Constantine would perform some administrative reforms. Under Diocletian, the equestrian class, the minor nobility, had been favored for use of imperial offices and governorships. The Senate has been totally stripped of their last vestiges of power and influence. Constantine recognized, though, that the old aristocracy would be needed. They are very rich and they have powerful connections in all levels of society. And so he sought to reintegrate into the empire by mixing them with the old equestrian order, where many of which were elevated to become senators themselves. And by this measure, he managed to include another potentially dangerous faction into the empire, alongside, the Christians and the other sects that had been decriminalized by Constantine Edict of Milan. So this was really another brilliant political move from Constantine, really highlights his political smartness, really emulating Augustus's genius in that way. And although it should be said, though, the Senate itself as an institution would remain completely powerless, really. It didn't really have any real jobs to do. It was there to rubber stamp the emperor's actions.
In Rome. And as a true student of Diocletian, Constantine issued many reforms of his own. Most importantly, the last major reform of the Roman military. We still had comitatenses limiting the navy and all, but now subdued barbarian hordes had a name, Federati, and the legates and duxes that ruled them were now led by the Magister Peditum and Magister Equitum, masters of foot and horses, and above them was the Magister Militum, master of armies, topped only by the emperor himself.
Yeah, and now we are including Federati officially into the Roman military. Federati were, of course, barbarians often that were allowed to settle in Roman territory, and in exchange they would pay their dues by military service. And Federati troops often were good to have as an auxiliary unit, because their style of fighting, they usually had skills and styles of fighting that were beneficial but weren't existent in the professional army, the Roman army. So they could be very useful in that way. And he established a new hierarchy within the military. We have the Magister Equitum and the Magister Militums. And this is a system that will be in place for almost the rest of the entire Roman Empire. So yeah, this is the last great army reform, as he said, although there would be more, of course, in the future, but none in this scale.
And to provide future emperors with a proper bodyguard, Constantine created the Palatini Palace Guards, which due to being elite soldiers and being denied the depravities of Praetorians would prove to be far more loyal. But as he reformed the armies, Constantine saw the rise of many half-Germans in the legions, with his suspicion of them shared by a young soldier recruit, Valentinian, whom held a hatred for Germans greater than any Roman that
Valentinian, another name to keep in mind in the future,
had ever lived. And so much had Constantine beaten the barbarians over the decades that he got away with building a bridge over the Rhine and rebuilding Trajan's bridge in the Danube, once slaughtering 100,000 Goths and retaking Lower Dacia.
Yeah, Constantine re-invaded Dacia to re-establish the provinces that had been evacuated by Aurelian, and he managed to succeed in establishing, well, it wasn't officially annexed, I believe, but there were client states basically across the Danube frontier. I'm not sure if you're gonna mention this, so I'm gonna mention it now. One of the other great reforms of Constantine was the introduction of the gold solidus coin. Now, the gold solidus was continuing on the monetary reforms issued by Diocletian. Diocletian had, as you may remember, issued a gold coin, a silver coin, a mixed silver and bronze coin, and a bronze coin. And Constantine would continue to build on this by issuing a new gold coin, the gold solidus, that would become the standard for all currency for 1,000 years to come. And it was basically a solid gold coin, a pure 99% or 96%, depending on, percentages could vary. 4.5 grams, pure gold coin. And what this did, this was only possible though, I should say, because Constantine had converted to Christianity. By converting to Christianity, Constantine was able to seize gold from the pagan temples, the old Roman pagan temples, and use it to melt them down and make coins. And Constantine thereby established some sort of gold standard, really a proto-gold standard. When this currency had, when he had access to this much gold, the currency had real value, and it was really stable. Because it was backed up by a pure metal, and he had them in quantities. And his successors would later discover new gold mines, which would allow them to mint sufficient amount of gold coins for it to become a more ubiquitous and stable currency than had been in the past. For the past, the gold coins have been issued. And this really helped because now he had a stable currency, and with the stable currency he could pay his administrators, he could pay for his armies with the gold coins, and really he, with these monetary reforms, were able to tamp down on inflation, although it didn't really solve the problem of the devalued currencies. The only problem with the gold solidus coins is, of course, that the old silver, denarii, and bronze coins became less and less worth. They were still subject to inflation. They were still devalued because the pure gold solidus coin was worth so much. When Constantine introduced the coin, one solidus was worth 275,000 denarii. And this meant that the poorer and lower, the poorer middle classes would continue to be hurt by this devalued currency. It would result in the minting of local currency and not officially sanctioned by the state. And it would also result in barter and trade to become more ubiquitous again. And the problem is this would hurt and gradually, over time, diminish long-distance trade and mass production of different types of goods. And this really hurt the Roman economy in the long term. Because the Roman Empire, for the longest time, has been this great trading network. All the roads and all the infrastructure built centered around the trade, all the ports. Rome really was a giant trading empire once. And it's that is going to decline going forwards, thanks to the fact that future Roman emperors were not able to solve the issue of the silver and bronze currencies being devalued and being practically worthless. But Constantine was able to stabilize the monetary situation by issuing the solidus coin. Yeah. So there's some information on Roman monetary and financial policy for those of you that are interested.
But if you will remember, it still is all downhill from here. For Constantine's rule would prove to be the last golden age of Rome.
Yep.
From here on, the empire would face an increasingly devastating crisis of instability, treachery, civil wars, and barbarian invasions worse than any nightmare. And it was all confirmed by the heirs he was doomed to pass the empire to. Of his 3 sons, Constantine II was the opposite of his father, weak, vain, and treacherous. Constantius II was intelligent and strong, but had grown cynical and distant due to Faustus' upbringing. And Constans was a fag, literally. He loved dick, very unchristian. So he then looked onto his nephews, like the sons of Constantius' new marriage, Dalmatius and Hannibalianus, as well as the sons of Julius, like Gallus, the step-grand-grand-grand-grand-grand-grandson of Caracalla, and also his half-brother, a very young Julian, in whom he sensed the most potential.
Julian, of course, is Julian the Apostate, who was quite a competent emperor, the last pagan emperor of Rome, too. So, you know, there you go.
But had to ignore due to his age. After giving it some thought, he sought again to revive the Tetrarchy by giving the west to Constantine II, Italy and its surroundings to Constans, the east to Constantius II, and both Thrace and Greece to Dalmatius. As for Hannibalianus, he was named King of Kings. And yeah, that implies what you think it implies. That's right. Constantine gave the entire unconquered Sassanid Empire to his nephew, as a sloppy seconds at that, on top of claiming that all Christians in the East were under his own personal protection.
That makes for a great casus belli in the future, you know, whenever Christians are being slighted, persecuted in the Sassanid Empire, you could just invade by being, oh, well, it is my role as the protector of Christians to intervene and save them. You would see, particularly the Russian Empire would love to use this excuse to intervene in the Balkans and in the Ottoman Empire, because the Russian Tsars and Tsarinas were the protectors of the Christian orthodoxy, and as such they had the right to intervene whenever Orthodox Christians were persecuted. So, you know, handy political religious tool to use.
The madman, which was something that Shapur's great-grandson, Shapur II, used as an excuse to invade the empire and destroy civilization. The peace broken, Constantine prepared to fuck their shit up, only to realize how fucked his own shit was. So weak and ill he became that after praying to God for answers, he realized he was about to die.
Yeah, Constantine was preparing his last final hurrah by invading the Sassanid Empire, but during preparations he realized he was growing very weak and very sick, and realized he wouldn't be able to do the campaign.
He was then rushed westwards Constantinople, seeking to die in the city he had built, but alas, he could only make as far as Nicomedia. After a life of service for the one true God, Constantine sought to legitimize the Christian faith once and for all, so as his final wish, he asked to be baptized.
It is said that Constantine waited so long to be baptized because he wanted to be cleansed of all his sins he had done during his life. I sort of believe that is true. Constantine seems to be genuinely concerned about spiritual matters and Christianity. And like I said, I do believe he was a genuine Christian.
Cleansed the way of all sin, despite having none, Constantine gave up to the call from high above, and left this mortal realm one final time. Having ruled as Rome's emperor for over 3 decades, he displayed wisdom and virtue, was never defeated in battle, defended the empire from barbarians countless times, reunited Rome after a terrible civil war, transformed Christianity into a Roman civilizing faith, and gave the empire a new capital that would stand for over 1,000 years. And it is for these reasons, and 1,000 reasons more, that history will forever remember him as Constantine the Great.
Alright, we reached the end of this episode, part 16 of the Unbiased History of Rome, about Constantine the Great. Constantine really earned his cognomen the Great in every sense of the word, with his military, administrative reforms, monetary reforms, religious policy, his efforts to reunite the empire, fighting the barbarians, really was the last great emperor of a united Roman Empire, I would say. And there would be great emperors in the future, like Justinian, Basil II, Alexius Komnenos, Constantine the 11th. There would be great emperors in the future, but they would be of Eastern Roman Empire only. There would never again be a great Roman emperor who controlled all of Rome. And as such, we leave the story of Constantine the Great, and now we will follow his successors. And I can only tell you guys that it's going all downhill from here on out. And the efforts of Aurelian, Diocletian, and Constantine have massively extended the lifespan of Rome, but in the end, many fundamental flaws of the empire remain in its institutions and the way things are going, and it is not sustainable. But with that, I leave you guys to your thoughts. If you have anything to add or any other comments, leave them down below. Leave a like and subscribe for more. We will be continuing on with part 17 soon enough. And with that, I bid you farewell.